I don't think that where you should be is Silicon Valley. What does it mean to get good feedback, right? It means that I learned from my Cosmopolitan experience was teams that are diverse work better together. You have to kind of like find your specialization and what makes you unique. Higher performing teams, they have this structure, this very interesting structure where
Shasi, what is your major?
Hey Magnus, my major is electrical engineering, computer science, and business.
Electrical engineering, computer science, and business. That's a mouthful, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
How did you get into this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I came into Berkeley originally as a mechanical engineering major. And I think like I applied as mechanical because I'm interested in, I guess, like fields like the automotive industry and aerospace. So like a couple of the experiences that I had in high school were kind of related to doing competitions in aerospace and the energy sector. And that's kind of how I got interested in, doing mechanical engineering, because a lot of those projects involved, building prototypes of different things. And I knew I wanted to do something hands-on. I knew I wanted to just build things. So that's kind of how I got interested in Mechie. And then once I came to Berkeley, obviously I started taking classes. I took an intro CS class. I also took a decal called PCB decal, printed circuit boards, and I really enjoyed that class in particular. And I kind of like began to see that, like many of the industries that I was passionate about, like energy, aerospace, like they also had this like electrical background to them, and I can kind of go into those industries from an electrical perspective as well. So that's when I decided to switch to EECS.
What motivated you, or sorry if I missed it, but what motivated you to apply to this PCB decal? Because I feel like as someone that is interested in building things, I feel like electrical components would be extremely intimidating to me, and the decal wouldn't necessarily be the first thing I like jump into,
Yeah, so I'm not gonna lie, like a lot of it was like external pressure from friends who were also doing
that's
the decal.
The best time to do things, isn't it?
Yeah. So my friends signed up for the decal, and then they were like, yeah, since we signed up for it, like you got to do it with us, man. So I think like that was a big factor. But also I like browsed the course website, and like I really liked the fact that like the final project is basically you get to design a PCB for really anything that you want to design within the scope of like 2 to 3 weeks. And so, like we ended up doing a heart rate sensor. So if you look at like your Apple Watch, like they come with like a little beeping green light on the back if you like flip it over, and that is called a PPG sensor. So that can actually measure your heart rate by looking at it sends out like infrared pulses into your veins, like over here, and then it measures the reflectance of blood that comes back. And so depending on the velocity of blood going through, which is obviously determined by how fast your heart is beating, it measures like different rates of reflectance. And so that's kind of how it can like quote unquote determine heartbeat. So we created a very like rudimentary and like imperfect version of that. I think like just the open-ended project nature of it was something that was super cool. And obviously like I've experienced building larger things. So building PCBs is requires a lot of like fine motor skills, and like the components are all very small. So like it was just cultivating that as well.
Right. So it seems like you have some good interest within the space of like building. Have you always been like this as you've grown up through elementary school, middle school, high school? What were those like early beginnings like for you, and what kind of interest did you take on?
Yeah, great question. So I think like most of the building experience that I had came from moving to Houston when I was about 8 years old. So like just to tell you a little bit more about my background, like I come from a family of engineers. My mom is an engineer by trade. She became a stay-at-home mom after she had me. And then my dad, he's also an engineer. He works in the oil and gas space as an expat, which basically means like we move around every like 4 to 5 years. Like obviously like I've been shaped by living in a bunch of different places globally, but also the fact that my parents are engineers, and like they kind of like tinkering with stuff. They like getting involved with whatever projects are going on at school as well. I think like in Houston we kind of moved into this brand new and shiny house, and like the concept of like a house was kind of foreign to me. Previously we just kind of like lived in apartments, like I got access to a garage for the first time. So that was kind of like where I was able to like set up shop. It started with like working on Legos. Like I'm still very passionate about building Legos. Like I have London Bridge somewhere in my like shipping container like that I need to like reassemble. But yeah, I think that's kind of like where it started. And then in middle school, we had a lot of projects that involved just like building prototypes of things in science class. And I think like that's kind of where I was able to kind of gain experience with things like 3D printing, woodworking, and stuff like that. So I think that's kind of like where I got my passion for building. And yeah, so.
That's really interesting. I love how wholesome that is, where you got access to like a space, almost like how a kid gets like his first room, his own chance at privacy. You had that chance of like creativity almost. Yeah. But I think it's really unique that your middle school actually gave you all these resources from like 3D printers and was there ever any kind of like class that kind of taught you that, or did you have to like kind of navigate that on your own through like...
Yeah. So I'd say I remember this one class. I think it was 8th grade. We called it like IPC, I think, Integrated Physics and Chemistry. And then it was really just a precursor to, I guess, like AP Physics C. And the teacher who taught it, she had been teaching at my school for many, many years, I think like over 30 plus years. And she was just an amazing teacher. I remember, she always used to encourage us to, not just like read the textbook, not just do practice problems, but she would set projects for us to do. So for example, when we were doing the space unit, when we learned about astronomy and when we learned about, star systems, how do star systems develop, how do stars and nebulas, how do nebulas give birth to stars, and then how do stars die? We had to not only like read the textbook, obviously, but also come up with like a visual explanation of how this whole process works. And so it was exactly like you'd imagine, presenting a paper at a conference. You would come with this like kind of threefold board that has all your findings, and that was kind of like how, I guess, in her way, she introduced us to the world of scientific research and presenting posters at conferences. And that process, like obviously when I was going through that, I didn't know any of this, like kind of was conducive to scientific presentation. But now that I'm in college and I've seen all of this, like I can kind of look back and say like, hey, that was like pretty cool that we kind of got started on that early. So yeah, it was just projects like that. And I think for another project, like she challenged us to think about like colonizing other planets. We focused on Mars for our project, and that involved like building a model. So we got like a big styrofoam block, and then we covered it in red clay, and then we kind of like mocked up like where we would place habitats and like where we would place rocket refueling stations, things like that. So yeah, it's just projects like that really got me interested. So.
I can definitely see where the mechanical engineering comes from now. Then yeah, I mean, if I grew up with being able to make all these models, I feel so motivated and inspired, I feel like. But you mentioned earlier a little bit about how you had to travel around a lot every 4 to 5 years. Tell me a little bit about that. How was your life because of that? Like I feel like I hear sometimes, or most of the time, people who go through that oftentimes struggle with like social anxiety, making new friends, and just being more outgoing because of the fact that they don't really have like stable people that they can always talk to. Is that like a similar experience to you, or how do you navigate through that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, actually when we were moving around during my early years, so I'll give you like a timeline, I guess. Like, so I was born in India. I was born in this town called Hyderabad, which is like it's a relatively big city now. One of the tech centers in India, and it's like in the south, right in the center. And yeah, I was born there, but my parents essentially just came to India for the delivery. Before that, they were living in Italy. So right after the delivery, with my grandparents, it was back to Europe. Mm-hmm. So from a very young age, I was kind of just like abroad.
Right, you've been to a lot of places.
Yeah, I didn't really have that. I guess I didn't really have that connection to my Indian identity. But yeah, so we lived in Italy for a bit, moved to Austria for about a year. And then my dad got an assignment in Canada, so we were there for about 4 years. And then we moved to Pittsburgh for a year, Houston for about 5 years, Singapore for about 4 years, and now California, where I'm studying. So yeah, I think like during those first early years where I was kind of like moving around Europe and going to Canada, I actually used to enjoy moving a lot. And I think what it stemmed from was the fact that like I was quite introverted when I was younger, didn't used to speak much in class, didn't really used to talk about my feelings to my parents or anything like that. So I think like every time I moved, I saw it as like an opportunity to kind of like get a new friend group. And every time we moved, I kind of thought to myself like, hey, this might be the place where I kind of like get to find my people, right? So so that was kind of my thoughts when I was growing up. And I think really when we moved to Houston, that's kind of like where I kind of like found my so-called like first best friends. And leaving them when we moved to Singapore was definitely like super difficult. So I think like over time, like I've grown to dislike moves more because of how it like displaces me from my friend groups. But at the same time, like I think moving to Singapore, that was definitely one of the harder things that I've had to do in life because of just the cultural shock. It took me about like a year to get adjusted to Singapore, and I really didn't like it the first time we moved there. And like it's just I guess like a customization process of
what about it was
getting used
so
to
different?
it, right? So a lot of things. I mean, Texas is very expansive, very wide. Singapore is kind of like this isolated city country in Southeast Asia, where you could drive from one end of the country to the other in about like 40 minutes. So it was just a completely different environment. And like in Houston, we had like a very big, a relatively big house, nice backyard, like American suburbia, I guess. And then in Singapore, it was like a smaller apartment on like the 33rd floor, right? So there was that. And then also Singapore has a very eclectic and diverse background when it comes to, not just like ethnicities of people that you interact with, but also the educational system. The educational system is super interesting because Singapore was essentially founded as a British colony back in, I think, like the 1800s. And a lot of the education system has kind of like followed that traditional pathway of going down the British, just following the British system. So coming from the US where it's very like open and project based, going into a system where it was like very test focused, exam based, that was definitely like also a learning curve for me. So
That must have been really hard for you. I mean, like, yeah, I already hate the tests that are going on here. I can't imagine like having a test define my entire life like it is in like other Asian countries. So through all this moving, I'm sure you've adopted some kind of like cosmopolitan like type view on everything you do. What are some instances where you've really been able to use these diverse perspectives for the things that you work on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's just kind of like permeates a little bit of everything that I do. Like just being a global citizen, I think like I'm just able to think in a way that is different to, I guess, like people who have lived in one region, one country for their entire life. So for example, whether it's like product design, I have experience with working with startups, running a few of my own. And so, like when we're designing, let's say like an app, right? We're thinking about not just like how users in the US will use this, but also like what features are important to maybe if we're going to market it to people in India, like what features are important to them as well. So, I think like just that has enabled, I guess like the teams that I've worked with to be a little bit more holistic, I guess, in that regard. And like a good example, a more concrete example would be, I was talking a little bit about doing competitions related to building. And so one of the competitions that I did was called the Conrad Challenge. So basically it's founded by Nancy Conrad, who's the widow of the late astronaut Pete Conrad. He was on, I believe, the Apollo 13 mission. So it's a great initiative, founded as like a competition to get people involved in like aerospace and energy. And you're just tasked with coming up with, I guess, like a solution to a problem in that specific industry vertical of aerospace. Like one thing that I learned from my Cosmopolitan experience was, I really believe in the fact that like teams that are diverse work better together, even though there might be some like challenges to working across borders. So for that competition, my team was comprised of friends from Singapore, friends from the UK, and friends from the US as well. So like obviously it was like really challenging, like stitching all of that together, coming up with like building a physical prototype. Like how do you do that across borders? So obviously that part of it was super difficult, but I think like in the end, we were able to just like create a more holistic product we were doing something related to like asteroid mining, which is like a very new and up and coming field. So there's a lot of policy gray areas in that regard. So like the European Union might say one thing about like how legal is it to extract minerals from an asteroid, and then the US might say something else. So I think like just having different people from different countries be able to say like, hey, the EU says this, but the US says this, right? That enabled us to kind of like create a project that was compliant, I guess, like in all those countries. So
that's crazy. I mean, it's already hard enough to like do a paper with someone who's like 13 hours ahead in a time zone. I can't imagine building out this entire project with people from all over the world. I think that's extremely like that's something to be proud of, like for sure. But before I go into asking you about all your different ventures within like startups, I want to ask you if you other than the point that you just made about having a diverse group in your team, what else have you found to be something that higher performing teams have in common?
It's a great question. I think higher performing teams, they have this structure, this very interesting structure where I wouldn't call the person who's in charge a leader per se, because they're not exactly taking a command and control approach. They're not exactly saying, hey, you guys need to do this by this deadline, but rather the team itself is kind of incentivized to get things done on time, to do good quality work, and really to collaborate together as a team to deliver results. And I think like where that stems from is you might have heard this quote. It's pretty common, a little bit cliche, I guess. Like a good leader, what a good leader does is he or she educates others to also become good leaders. And so I think I particularly resonate with that quote. And a lot of the teams that I've been on where I am kind of like in a leadership position or a founder position almost, I have found that, democratizing that power, giving some of it back to the people on the team is something that goes a very long way. So for example, like giving them control over decisions, giving them control over deadlines, and saying like, hey, does this like work with your schedule? Like, what are we looking at in terms of like an ETA on this assignment? Just having those conversations and being like responsive with your team, I think goes a super long way. And I guess like another thing that I've seen in common amongst like high performing teams is, like I am not the biggest of believers in the concept of having like meetings, weekly catch-up meetings. I think meetings are to a certain degree kind of like a waste of time, because they're this like echo chamber of like ideas that you could have just emailed to someone or Slack them about, right? So I think like high performing teams, what they're able to do in the meetings that they do have, like the meetings that they have are like kind of like based on an ad hoc basis. So whenever they discover something new, whenever they fail really badly at something, then they'll have a meeting to kind of like debug and debrief, right? And it's not just like we're having a meeting because like I put it on the calendar on Friday at like 5 p.m., right? So I think like there's that angle to it as well. And I think high performing teams also, like they have very good incentive structures in place. And usually the people who you find on these teams are very passionate about the things that they do, so much so that they're willing to, contribute even if they're having a bad day, even if, it means working overtime and going for a long night, right? So I think like just common things like that are what, kind of incentivize productivity on teams and also enable them to do good work. So
I think I definitely do resonate with that. Like everything you said, from basically providing the people on your team with some kind of purpose or like some kind of defined role. It's proven psychologically. I think in the really famous book that I'm sure you've heard of, How to Win Friends and Influence People, that's one of the topics that they discuss. It's like there's a lot of power when it comes to giving someone a specific role. They take pride in it, right? And the passion. They do everything they can to fulfill that role. And so, yeah, same thing with the meetings. Like, man, I can't tell you how many meetings I just go to. 1 hour, 45 minutes of it is just total useless crap that some person is talking about their day, or there's some like minor issue, or we're going back and forth on some kind of topic. It's like, yeah, it's like you said, one message could have solved it all. So I can definitely see where you're coming in with why these principles are like the formula for like a really high performing team. So talk to me about your different startups, what have been your favorite teams? Why and what did you guys do?
Yeah, great question. So I think, so a couple of the startups and projects that I've worked on, some of these projects that I was part of as building through competitions, they kind of turned into startups as well. Like this one asteroid mining startup that we had, that one was kind of like commercialized, and the concept was, I guess like not really licensed, but like I guess like given to a company that was already in the space. So that was a project that I was really passionate about because, I think like working with an international team, that's really what enabled us to differentiate and say like, hey, we have this product that is actually like compliant, and we have the system that you can put into place in terms of like which spacecraft are going to be doing the mining that will actually be compliant with existing rules, right? And so I think like that team was particularly high performing because of the internationality of it. And I think like another project that I worked on much similarly, my co-founder was based in the UK. He was actually on the project that I just talked about, the asteroid mining one as well. But yeah, so the idea was based around the premise of looking at the fashion industry. And the fashion industry actually contributes a very significant amount to global carbon emissions and also plastic wastage. I believe the number is somewhere around like 9% or 8%, which is actually higher than global air travel emissions and ship emissions combined. So I think like we just looked at that number and we were kind of shocked. And I think like looking at numbers, looking at statistics like that is how many great businesses are kind of born. And so we were kind of inspired by an idea that we had back in middle school. So we were presenting a pitch for a electrified version of Houston, because I was living in Houston at that point of time. So we had our little model with like a mock-up maglev train, like we had a little styrofoam pipe, and then we put like neodymium magnets, and we have a little battery that goes through. And then we had like little city towers that were made of like recycled plastic bottles that we just found on the street and that we spray painted. So we had our little model and we were going up and presenting to the judges. And the judges were kind of like coming around the tables, interacting with us, and just like to kind of like make us feel in a feel at home conversational environment type thing. And I don't remember exactly who it was, but someone had like the genius idea the night before of 3D printing bow ties for the event for everyone on the team to wear. Because some of the components on our model were also 3D printed. And so someone was like, yeah, we should 3D print some bow ties. It would like go nice with that. And
That's such
so,
a
yeah,
unique
so
thing.
we literally just whipped up a design, and it's basically like a clip-on. So you have like your button at the top, and then you just like, you have a little hole in your plastic bow tie, and then you just insert it. So yeah, like at the competition, I think we got more questions about our bow ties than our actual model. So that's kind of like when we were thinking like, hey, like people might actually be interested in this stuff. So like fast forward 2 years, and then I was in junior year of high school. And with my co-founder, who was on that team, the Energy City team, we kind of like came back to that idea of like, how can we solve this issue of the plastic problem in the fashion industry? And we were looking at like fabrics specifically, and like the nylon that goes into making these fashion accessories like bow ties and things like that. And we were like, hey, why not, to whatever degree is possible, like 3D print some of these fashion accessories using filament made from recycled plastic. So the basic premise is that we looked at different accessories that we felt could be 3D printed, like cufflinks and bow ties. Obviously, like 3D printing hasn't advanced to the point where we can like print a purse or a wallet or a T-shirt. But hopefully in the future, like additive manufacturing will get to that point. But yeah, so we focused on smaller products like that, and we bought the filament from a supplier in the UK that actually recycles PLA pellets made from things like crushed plastic bottles, water bottles, and so the entire process is very circular. So you buy the product, which is made of recycled materials, you wear it. You can also dispose of it and recycle it, and then it gets melted back into filament and process repeats. So that was kind of like the premise of that product. And I know that was like a little bit of a long-winded explanation.
Oh no, that's exactly what I wanted.
Yeah, but you were talking about like how that relates to the teams that I've worked with, and how the performance of those teams kind of like came through, right? So again, I think like the internationality definitely enabled us to connect to consumers across a wide variety of geographical regions. My co-founder, who's based in the UK, he kind of like set up shop with his own like 3D printer setup in his garage, and he began shipping them out of his garage to different countries in the EU. And obviously, like if you're geographically located in the EU, shipping is a lot cheaper as opposed to like shipping it from the US. So, and then I was based in the US, so I kind of like was able to ship to everywhere in the US. And we ended up saving a lot in cost that way, as opposed to just shipping everything from the US, as opposed to like if both of us had been in the same place, right? So I think like just things like that is where geographical advantage comes into play. And having a lot of regional hubs, which I think like you see a lot of these days with companies, right? You go to a big city, chances are you'll see like a major bank will have an office, right? And it's kind of like these companies, these multinational corporations, they have an office in every major city. And it almost seems excessive, but I think like examples and stories like this are kind of like why companies do that and why they are able to really achieve like geographical collaboration across borders. I think it's just having that demand to kind of like tap into any regional ecosystem at any point in time and just draw on those insights and strategic advantages from being in that region. So I think that's no. I was just gonna say I think that's just another example of how high performing teams I think come from geographical diversity. So
right. And now that you're like bringing that up to me, I never really thought about that perspective. So it's making me think like, wow, I guess that would be a really valuable insight. But knowing what you know about like communicating with people from like foreign countries, how would you go about giving someone advice towards how they can connect with people without like moving around everywhere, because not everyone might have that luxury.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Or curse. I mean, however you want to see it.
Yeah. I mean, the internet is a great invention, right? So, I think like nowadays, you're able to connect with a lot of people on LinkedIn, through, just cold emailing, cold outreach. And, like most of the time I've actually found that people in, developing countries in developing regions are frankly more responsive than people, in the US, when it comes to replying, to, cold outreach about career advice, how they got to where they were. And I guess like this is another quote unquote hot take that I have, but I think like really if you're a startup founder or if you're just someone who's entrepreneur-curious, I don't think that where you should be is Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is kind of like a cop-out almost, in my opinion, because the ecosystem has been established. It's already here for you, right? If you're a startup founder and if you have an idea that you feel is widely applicable to a wide range of customers, I think where you should be is a developing country. Regions like Africa, India, China, this is really where the ecosystem has not been built, and that's where the true challenge lies. And I think like really developing that type of ecosystem, that's kind of like where I find my passion. I like doing hard things. And obviously like having Silicon Valley, having that network at your convenience just to tap away, that's super interesting. That's super nice to have. But if you're a builder and if you're curious about building networks, what better way to do it than just to do it yourself in a place where those networks haven't exactly been built already, right? And so that's why I feel like, in the future, I might want to go work in a developing economy. I actually have had experience working in developing economies. And really what I found is that this notion of a third world country, which some people term it as, it really stems from this idea of, I guess, like geographical development theory. And like third world country, I feel like is a bit of a misconstrued term and a little bit of overused term. So for example, I was in Cambodia last summer. I was doing an internship for like a small bank that does microloans for farmers. And having worked in banks in the US as well, like smaller regional banks, I can really confidently say that this Cambodian bank that I worked at had a better tech infrastructure than some of the American banks that I worked at. So I remember walking in on the first day, and there's like this 16 panel like LCD monitor that they have on like the third floor, which is their tech center, like literally streaming live time data about their loan portfolio. So as they onboard customers, as they give out loans, like that graph of like, how much loans are we giving out, but also like what is our exposure to risk? Like, did we give out a loan to someone who we think like might not be able to pay it back in time? Like all of that is showing up real time on those boards. And so I think like developing nations and developing countries, that's really where the opportunity lies, because everyone's hungry and everyone's really desperate to make it, right? And everyone's kind of like trying to build like the next Silicon Valley of the world. And I think like that's really where interesting opportunity lies. So I would say like if you're interested in, globalization, if you're interested in connecting with people across like a range of different countries, like try reaching out to people from a developing economy. You might find that like most of the time they're super responsive and have really interesting opinions. And sometimes they might even have like more interesting opinions than your traditional VC from Silicon Valley, for example. So
right. And I feel like in third world countries too, like there's a lot of people that witness problems firsthand, like right in front of them, and it's not as there's not as much to really do, like in a more literal sense in those countries, other than solve that problem. Rather in the US, it's like, oh, I can really solve this problem, or I could just leave it to someone else, right? I feel like people are more in foreign countries are more driven to really create that change.
No, definitely. And I think like if you just look at like economic development theory, like this is something that is super fascinating to me, right? Like I feel like we're at this very interesting inflection point where growing up, you might have heard a lot about China, like the rapid industrialization of China, rapid population growth, right? And we are all living at this very interesting time where China has already kind of like peaked in terms of its population, and actually population is going down, and they're trying to incentivize people to have more kids even, right? And India has kind of like taken over that spot now. And like throughout history, we've kind of seen like there's this very like almost formulaic rise and fall in the economies of countries and how they come to power, right? And a lot of it comes down to population dynamics and population growth. Because fundamentally, a lot of the issues that you have related to, let's say, like infrastructure, healthcare, convenience for people, a lot of it boils down to simply that population growth in that country, right? And having so many people packed into such a dense area. And so I think like just, ideas like this, like macroeconomic trends and things like that, that's stuff that like really interests me, because like fundamentally, if you think about it, a lot of problems can be just boiled down to like these few simple subsets. And I think like, although the trends are there, like the cyclical trends are there for us to see, and you can kind of look back in history and see that countries have experienced this rise and fall, whether that be like the United States, whether that be Japan, and you're able to see it in front of your eyes. I think like a lot of people are still negligent to kind of give up on this idea of like the old world guard, and kind of like shift over to developing economies. And like I think like that's just a matter of, I guess, like I don't know, maybe perception, but also I guess like whenever it comes to new opportunities, there's always risk, and there's always that sense of like exploration and going out into the unknown. And I guess like that's maybe a risk that some people are not willing to take. So
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's something that also fascinates me. It's like, first of all, asking the right questions and really getting to the roots of why some ethnic groups are the way they are, right? Especially in the United States. Why do they go into these certain jobs? Why do they have these stereotypes? Like for this and this reason. Going into that's an interest that I find to be extremely fascinating, because every group has like their own story. But going off of what you said about the developing economies, I always wondered why in the US there's the American dream, right? Everyone's chasing to be rich, whereas in Asian countries you don't really see that. I'm half Japanese. In Japan, I didn't really, in the past, Japanese people, I feel like, just kind of lived out life. They have these like 3-generation wood shops that make puzzle boxes, like stuff like that. Like you as like a US citizen would be like, why aren't you like working your ass off to become this startup founder, business owner, service-based owner, something like that, to get rich? And you look into it more and it's like, oh, it's because they have like healthcare paid for. They have all these different things that look over the people. The middle class is huge. The middle class is comfortable. Whereas in the US, there's this huge disparity between poor, rich, and like the shrinking middle class, right? Which is why it's like pushed on a message so much here in the United States, where it's like you need to get rich, or else everything from your healthcare, your family, you can't do anything
Right.
unless you make money.
Right. I mean, capitalism at its finest.
Yeah,
Right? So
right,
yeah,
right.
I think like yeah, a lot of it. You brought up a lot of interesting points, and I think yeah, a lot of it has to do with just the way the U.S. has kind of been structured in recent years, and you know, like there's very much this notion of the U.S. pays the best salaries as well. Like I need to come to the U.S. to get a really good education and get a good job, and you know, like if you're perhaps like an international student coming from abroad, that the money you gain from that job would perhaps maybe be sent to your family back home to support them as well, right? So I think like really the U.S. has become the haven for, I guess, like the safe way out, right? And so people even from India, from Japan, from Southeast Asian countries, you might have heard about this concept called the brain drain, where a lot of talent from these countries is just departing for the U.S. and going into jobs that are, frankly speaking, just I guess like to a certain degree like corporate slavery, basically. Software engineering jobs at big companies, you know, like just banking jobs at big banks, and I think like just this notion of success that America has defined for itself, the American dream, getting rich. I think like to a certain degree, like in when the American dream began, like there was this notion of entrepreneurship, discovery, right? And now the definition has become so twisted, and with just changing definitions of how you value money and how you value your time, that people are saying like, hey, like the American dream might be to do 2 years of banking and then 2 years of private equity, right? So I think like just this notion of the American dream is something that has changed a lot over time, and it's definitely interesting to see. Some people say like the American dream is like so-called dead. I don't think so. I think like there's a lot of entrepreneurship still going on, especially in places like California. And I think that our generation specifically has this commonality of just being, I guess, like fed up with how being told about like how to do things, right? And so whether it comes to like political systems, whether it comes to jobs, whether it comes to just like overall like socially entrenched systems, like I think like Gen Z specifically is really trying to break out of the mold and do something different and kind of like make a name for themselves as a generation, and not just accept what institutions before us have done, right? And so I think that's why you see a lot of people in revolutionary industries like crypto and decentralized finance. A lot of them are super young. Like you won't find you know, like a millennial probably in these fields most of the time, right? So I think like just that notion of trying to shift away from the norms that society has defined, I think that's a powerful commonality, and I think like perhaps that's where the American dream can again be redefined to perhaps a more fluid, I guess, like definition of how you define success. But going back to your point, I think you brought up a really interesting example of how in Japan, like there are these century-old shops that are run by like 3 generations of craftsmen, right? And so I think like those types of businesses, those types of industries, like in their own regard, they deserve to be seen and heard in the economies of the world, because you know, like frankly speaking, sometimes like innovation for just simply for the sake of innovation is kind of overrated, and I think that's really where it results in product market oversaturation. Like think about how many apps we have for like delivering food these days, right? Yeah, so many apps, right? For rideshare, for food delivery, for alcohol delivery, so many apps out there, right? And that's really where I guess like innovation just for the sake of it, or trying to look at what other people are doing and jump into it just because it's the new hottest thing. I think that's really where oversaturation arises. And I think, you know, this notion that you've brought of having that idea of passion and having that idea of craft is something that's really important as well. And you know, like I was watching a video, I think like very similar to what you said about I think like a Japanese soy sauce manufacturer, right? And so most of the soy sauce processes have now been like industrialized, and like everything's kind of like done in a factory. But this elderly Japanese man, I think he's like maybe like 85 or going on his 90s. He's still in the hills. He's still in the regions where soybeans grow, and he's harvesting everything by hands. He's putting them in barrels that his ancestors used to use, right? And he's doing everything by hand, and really he's even able to charge like the necessary markup for it, and people are willing to buy it. And like really, like I think there's this resurgence of the notion of like what are people doing, and like what are their passions truly, right? And I guess like innovation for the sake of innovation, going into a job just because I guess like it's the new hottest thing to do, or because it pays well, like all of these tie back to the notion of, I guess, like doing something for the sake of like doing it, or I guess like doing it because of external pressures. And really I admire these people who stick with what they've been doing for hundreds and thousands of years, because sometimes the best methods are the ones that are the simplest, the ones that are the oldest, the ones that have been passed down by word of mouth through tradition, right? And that's really why I really like Japanese culture a lot, because of the way that, like obviously like there's been a lot of advancement, there's been a lot of technology that's been arising in the cities, right? And if you look at the video game industry, like that's almost single-handedly been developed by Japan, right? And it's been brought to billions of people worldwide, right? And like examples of innovation in that regard, where it's super novel, where it's super creative, I think that's really where you should look to go if you're a startup founder, right? And I think like equally speaking, you should learn from these people who are balancing, or these countries that are balancing like innovation with tradition. And like I think that's just like an astounding thing that Japan has achieved. So
Exactly. And I think you couldn't have said it any better. It's like the point you brought up with this generation just finally stepping up and saying, oh, why does it have to be done this way? I think that's really accurate. And obviously there's the good and bad parts that come out of the fact that we have a more verbal generation, but there's definitely a lot of benefits that I see in the future being a big positive. But there is something I am curious to hear your thoughts on. So recently, Japan has been extremely big in the startup space. And the reason for it is, like I mentioned before, the economy isn't as great as it used to be. The middle class is shrinking. There's more poor people and there's more wealthy people. So do you think this model of generational businesses are dying? Or do you think it's just something... Is it like a waving pendulum? Is it like as soon as the pendulum reaches pure, just everything startup, it'll swing back down to like generational? Or do you think we're just driving super far away from generational businesses now, and the hot new thing is for each person to find their own space through a startup?
Yeah, that's a really insightful point. I think like ultimately it boils down to what consumers want in terms of their products, right? So I think like when it comes to certain things, consumers might have experienced like the latest and greatest. I'm going to use soy sauce as a really bad example, but soy sauce, like, maybe consumers have experienced the latest and greatest flavors that come out of, like, say, a place like Kikkoman. Kikkoman's a bad example because they've been kind of, like, doing the traditional recipe, but say, like, a company comes in, like a startup, and they start making, like, exotic soy sauce flavors, right? Mixing it with other things, maybe making, like, a Mexican twist on soy sauce, right? And integrating some of those spices. Fusion something, right? Yeah, exactly. So, I feel like, a certain branch of consumers will then say, like, hey, I want to try this, like early adopters, right? And they'll say, like, I want to try something new because I want to question the ways of how it's been done before. And I think, like, this is where the concept of, like, the swinging pendulum kind of goes. I think in a lot of industries, we've kind of seen this. So, like, in the agricultural industry, consumers actually used to be like super receptive to genetically modified foods because, there was so much promise of like enhanced vitamins, and I guess like, increased iron, more protein, all from just eating the same carrot, I guess. Right. So, there was this notion of like, yeah, we should totally support genetically modified foods. Right. And then these scathing reports came out about, Monsanto, about like these big companies, and how like they essentially like lied about some of these claims that were made about GMOs and how, perhaps GMOs could have some adverse effects on health. And recently those claims have kind of like since been disproved, but the damage has kind of been done to public perception, right? And now everyone wants Whole Foods, everyone wants Trader Joe's, everyone wants local and organic, right? And so like I think like there's a place in time for these new companies to come in, right? And then there's a place in time where the pendulum swings back, and then consumers are like, let's go back to the way things were always done, right? And that's where you pay the premium for a soy sauce that comes from the hills of Japan that's been crafted the same way it has for thousands of years, right? Because you're sick and tired of seeing like all these new derivatives on the shelves, and you wanna kind of go back to like where everything originated from, right? And I think like what's interesting about the world today is kind of like seeing which industries are at which points on that pendulum. So a couple industries like might be like very, very new, and like they might like kind of like be like with these so-called like market creators, right? And those are like the industries where people are willing to experiment and try new things. And then other industries are kind of like a little bit more entrenched perhaps, and people are trying to like go back to the ways of old, right? So I think like it's just really interesting to see like that interplay. So I think, yeah, to answer your question, I think definitely like the pendulum analogy was a good one. I think that's something that I think is definitely going on right now.
There's a lot of things about your psychology I want to keep picking on, but I kind of want to get into now, like, tell me about your involvement on campus. You're a college student. You're going on to your sophomore fourth semester, right? Tell me about what you've involved yourself with. What are your current interests right now? Has it shaped over the first time you came here?
Yeah, I think a lot of my interests currently have been shaped by Berkeley, and I think like a lot of what I've been trying to get into has been shaped by, I guess, like what others have like incentivized me to do, and what others have kind of like sometimes dragged me to do, like that one PCB class that I took. And I think like a lot of it has just been like accident. A lot of it has just been luck, reaching out to the right people at the right time, and has enabled me to make connections in certain places, like in the venture space, for example. Like that's definitely not something that I knew anything about coming into college. Like I had a startup, obviously, and I was familiar with this concept of like raising funding from VCs, but did I know like how a term sheet works? No. Did I know how like safe notes work? No, absolutely not. So like it was just a matter of, I guess, like meeting the right people who then said like, hey, your background might be a good fit for this. Like I also came from a similar background. Like this is why I got interested in venture, right? And I think like, yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
Before you continue,
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that like maybe the audience knows, but can you tell me what venture is? Like what is venture capital?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So venture capital refers to when a startup is looking to raise money. So a startup might come to the market with an idea, right? But oftentimes that idea is pretty broad, pretty expansive, and it requires money to fund production, fund operations, hire new employees. It just requires money and cash inflow in order to get that product off the ground and into the hands of consumers. And so venture capital comes in when founders essentially can't bootstrap their firm anymore. Like they can't contribute any more of their own funds. And they need a large cash inflow of, like, say, hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. And venture capital is essentially just glorified debt. So they come in with an ask of the startup will come in with an ask of, say, like, we want $100,000 for 10% of our company, and then VCs will negotiate, and they'll kind of like come to terms and determine a final percentage. And yeah, it's essentially glorified debt because like the venture firm will provide the money to the company. The company is then basically looking to pay it back through that equity stake, right? And the thing that I guess like people need to know the most about venture is that unlike debt from your bank that you might take out like as a loan, venture debt is very different because the venture capital firm has to face the very real consequence that this business might go kaput in 3 months and then not be able to pay any of their money back.
I imagine that's pretty common in this
exactly
space.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's some crazy statistic, like 9 out of 10 startups fail.
Oh my gosh,
like that. So
that's crazy.
So like, yeah, with that being said, like I think like getting into the space has been very much about connections. Venture is a very connection-driven industry. Really, anyone can kind of learn the basics of venture. There's not that much of a high like barrier to entry to it. Really, the highest point of like the barrier to entry is knowing people in venture and knowing people in the industry. And really, Berkeley, fortunately, has been a very good learning point for me because of the strong venture ecosystem and the strong startup culture here on campus. So we have a lot of VCs who come to campus to scout. We have even student-run VCs that will drop some investments on startups that they see that they like. And just being at the heart of this ecosystem has been really just a blessing to kind of say the least. And going back to a point that I had about earlier about like being in Silicon Valley and kind of like building that out, I think like obviously like to a certain degree, I think like obviously like every startup founder should have the experience of being in Silicon Valley at some point in time. And personally, like with these connections that I've kind of like developed, I'm trying to maybe like look to pay it forward, helping out get students who are younger than me who are interested in the space as well, but also taking like my newfound learnings from the US and applying that to developing economies where there may not be such a strong venture ecosystem and there may not be some of these, I guess, like learnings from developed countries. So
you mentioned that this is a very network driven like space to be in. How did you go about, can you give me like a specific example, like your personal story of how you ran into the very first person that kind of opened these doors for you?
Yeah, for sure. So, so I actually work with a co-scout named Hari. He's like lurking over there in the background. But so him and I, we reached out to a senior in our class. So we're part of a program called MET, which is the dual degree between engineering and business that I was mentioning earlier. And so we reached out to an upperclassman who was involved in venture. And like at that point in time, we really did not know what venture was. Like we had a cursory understanding, but really we just kind of like reached out to learn more and to see if it was something that we'd be interested in. And on that call, really he established for us like what is venture and like the fact that like you guys as college students can engage with this ecosystem. Like it's not that difficult to learn about it. And really what resonated for both of us, I think, is like seeing his story and how similar it was to our interests and our stories, and just having that person who has kind of like been there and done that, like that definitely helped a lot for us when it came to I guess like finding opportunities in the space. And yeah, like that call, like obviously a lot of it is just luck, I guess. Like that call kind of led to the opportunity for us to be like venture scouts for his firm. And like through the scouting program, obviously we learned a lot just by doing like how do you due diligence a startup, like what startups in what spaces are kind of like I guess like so-called like good investments. And yeah, it's just like that one domino that falls that like kind of has a catalyst effect on the others. So yeah, it's just about getting that one domino to fall.
It's crazy, isn't it? Like people, I feel like a lot of college students, they're so afraid to ask people for things, and yet it seems like your future can be shifted just from a simple LinkedIn message, or just from
one conversation.
A little conversation. It could just completely shift the way your professional career goes.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So is there anything is your life completely professional? Do you do any clubs on campus, or?
I am. Yeah, I'm involved in a couple clubs. So I'm part of BC, Berkeley Consulting. As the name suggests, we consult for like a variety of different companies in different industries, and that has been a really great experience for me in terms of like exposure to industries that I wouldn't have otherwise considered. So I've like worked with nonprofits, worked in the food and beverage space, worked with hotels, and frankly speaking, like none of those three things were like interests for me like when I came into college. But now I can like confidently say that like I would maybe like consider a career in them, like if given the opportunity, right? So like just that exposure to different industries has like definitely like been something like that's a driving force. And I think like I think really it's like the reason why I joined BC, and I don't think I had this insight like when I was joining the club, but like now that I look back on it, like it's something that I appreciate is the variety of the projects that we do and the like variety of industries that we work in. And I think like one commonality in my personality traits is that like I have like a decently short attention span, and I think like it's just gotten worse because of like my social media usage. But yeah, so I think like to a certain degree, like I just like variety a lot. I like doing different things every day, and I hate like doing rote tasks like doing the same work, the same job, like day in, day out is not very interesting to me, not very appealing. So I think that's why I'm interested in things like consulting, where you work on projects with like very different clients, venture where you work with like a startup that's in like generative AI one day and then like biotech the next day, right? And I like that ties back into like I guess my international background and just like wanting to move around and experience different cultures as well. So I think like just the sense of variety that's like helped drive like my club involvement on campus. And I think like also I'm part of a couple like engineering societies on campus, just like help develop my technical skills. Part of like the rocketry club, and part of a new club on campus that was actually co-founded by myself and my roommate Alan, who you interviewed as well. That one is called VTOL at Berkeley, and it's a very exciting new project. And like having that experience of starting a club, which is in many ways is similar to kind of like creating a startup, has been a really cool experience as well.
That's really interesting. So you've really been able to keep in touch with both the business side and the engineering side, like similar to like what your major follows and what you kind of came in as. But I'm curious. So because I've kind of picked, like you mentioned, I did interview Alan. He kind of explained how he enjoys just kind of getting everyone on the same page and kind of motivating everyone to have the same vision. What kind of role do you think you play on VTOL at Berkeley?
Yeah, good question. I think I played the role of the devil's advocate. So I think a lot of the ideas we have in VTOL are very like expansive, very ambitious, and obviously like it's an industry that requires that ambition, because I mean it's literally flying cars. Like I don't know what is more sci-fi.
They usually call that like a tar pit idea, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think like to a certain degree there needs to be that innovation, right? And it's easy to kind of like get lost in the creativity, to get lost in the details of like let's pursue like 50 different ideas at the same time. And I think like where I come in is like I guess like consider myself a little bit of like a realist, practical person, and like I guess where I kind of like see myself adding value is like giving clarity to which things we think we should prioritize first. And I mean like no idea is a bad idea obviously, but it's just like certain ideas will be obviously like better, maybe even better bad ideas than others. So like I think like it's just about like prioritizing those in the right way. And I guess like sometimes like saying no to things just because we don't have the capacity to do that as a club. And sometimes that involves like having hard conversations with people and giving candid feedback. And that's not something that I've ever like really backed down from. Like I like to just kind of like tell it as it is. And I think like for a club like VTOL that's very ambitious, like I think it's like important to have like that realist aspect to it as well. And it ensures that like, like we stay in check with what's actually like achievable versus like what our vision for the future is.
So I feel that sometimes blind optimism is one of the greatest ways for a team to kind of keep going and pushing. Like, oh, it's going to work. It's going to work. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your pessimistic side or almost like realistic side, like you mentioned, has kind of negatively affected your team?
That's a good question. I think definitely like when you're a startup founder, it's pretty hard to be a pessimist or a realist because you kind of you have to believe in your product, obviously, like number one. And I think like this is a challenge that is commonly faced by founders in the space, especially like when they decide like when it's a serial entrepreneur and then they have so many ideas that they want to work on, and they have this one idea that's in the pipeline that they want to commercialize. Like how do you make that decision to continue pursuing whatever it is that you're doing to kind of like show that you have like that grit, you have that willingness to make it work no matter what it takes, because obviously that's what it takes to run a startup. Like you have to be willing to take a million rejections and take a million no's, and you kind of have to be a little bit crazy, right? But then how do you also balance that with being like a realist and saying like how do you know when to say like, hey, this isn't going to work, maybe I should turn to a different idea, right? And that's something that like I've obviously like struggled a little bit with, having these roles as both like I guess like a traditional engineer who's like looking to make everything like optimized, make everything like safe, make everything like very, I guess, like clean and like engineering principled, but then also as like a startup founder who's like looking to break the rules a little bit, right? And like be a little bit crazy and think outside the box. So I think it's a lot about like knowing which hat to put on when. So I guess like when it's time to like just have a candid conversation about like giving feedback to people, for example, I think that is definitely like not the place for like unconstrained optimism. And I think there was this one really good book by Ray Dalio. You might have read it. It's called Principles. And so that book really resonated with me because he talked about, like how people these days are kind of like, I guess like almost like offended to get like real feedback and like that kind of like hurts their feelings and like he really encouraged people to think about like what does it mean to get good feedback, right? It means that you're actively like solving a problem and you attempted it, which is like already 90% of the way there. And like candid feedback is simply going to make you better. And once you realize that, and once you kind of like get that dopamine hit from getting candid feedback, like it really does change your perspective on things. And like when people say like, hey, I think you maybe didn't do a great job on this, like you no longer like feel down, but like you're actually like really optimized. You're really incentivized to get out there and improve on whatever it was that you're doing, right? So I think it's just about like knowing which hat to put on when, and then like when it's like pitching to an investor, obviously like you want to have that sense of like optimism and like it's gonna work, and like not getting boggled down by like the immense amount of no's that you'll get from funding, right? So yeah, I think it's just about like having the ability to switch between those two. So
very cool.
Yeah,
I'm gonna switch gears here a little bit. You've talked about a lot of startups. You've talked about your jobs within banking. You've talked about consulting. Yeah. So I'm sure you know a thing or two about interviews and how to get your foot into the door with some of these great companies, competitive companies and clubs that a lot of people seek after. What are the tips you would give to high schoolers, college students to really break into any industry that they want to?
Yeah, I think really whichever industry you choose to pursue, there was this one person who gave me some really good advice, which is, like it's great to be a generalist. It's great to be kind of like a jack of all trades. But at some point, whether that be in high school, which honestly I think is a little bit early to kind of specialize, but in high school, in college, like you have many doors that are open, but eventually some of those doors will start closing. And sometimes you have to be the one to close those doors. And eventually you have to kind of like find your specialization and what makes you unique. Now, it might be a combination of like 3 or 4 different things, but obviously like no one can be good at everything. And so I think really when I've like been reading a lot of resumes for club applications and things like that, and even things that come up in interviews frequently, is I find that people have a lack of like a common thread throughout their applications. So like job interviews, they might ask you to, I guess like answer a bunch of different behavioral questions, or like answer some questions and then maybe write an essay, right? So I think like it's just nice to have like a narrative structure that flows through your experiences. So if you've done, say like a bunch of finance / biotech roles, like you might find a nice way to like integrate that into a nice story that you wrap up and look into like your motivations for getting into that, and like how you develop that niche, and really why you're good at that niche more so than anyone else. And I think that's really the key, because like these clubs, these jobs, they get so many applicants, right? It's about like, I guess like finding that thing that you're better at than everyone else. And it might be like supremely niche, but like, it's just about like having the courage to say like, I'm going to put this on my resume, even though it like might not be like my most clouded experience. Like this fits with my story, and I'm going to talk about it. Right. So there's that aspect to it. I also think a lot of job searching today can be automated through some of the tools that we're seeing come up with like generative AI and things like that. So I've wasted a lot of time like just literally filling in the same information like 50,000 times on like a bunch of different job applications. And now there's like nice tools. I believe there's like this tool called like Simplify, where you just like literally you type in your details like once, like your name and like your experiences in bullet point form. And then for any job site, like obviously there's like a bunch of different ones. Like I think there's like Lever, Workday, etc. For any job site, it'll kind of like just autofill it for you. And that's the power of technology today, right? So leverage technology to your advantage, and use tools like generative AI to like, I guess, like proofread your resume bullets, like look for impact in those resume bullets. I know that's something that's like harped on a lot. Like use GPT to like see if like there's a better version of what you're talking about, right? And use like Copilot to fill out these job applications for you so that you can get more of them out, and really just like kind of like use the tools that no one else is using to just improve your advantage overall. So
Very cool. So, it seems like you're very confident. You really understand, you're introspective about yourself and within all these fields. What role does college play in your life? Why would you willingly go through this education system that is taking up your time when all that time to you, from what I'm understanding and what I'm seeing from you, could be spent more towards all these cool projects that you're a part of?
Sure. Yeah, that's a very insightful question. Again, I think it goes back to a lot of what we talked about earlier about like societal pressures. So there's a degree of societal pressure to go to college, especially in the US, right? It's a component of the American dream. Like it's just everyone's kids wish to go to a very good college in the US, and it's been a lot of parents' dreams as well. So for me personally, like that was definitely like a big driver of why I decided to come to college, specifically in the US. Because like I obviously could have applied to a bunch of universities in Singapore and Canada, but I chose to come to the US because like to a certain degree, like that was my parents' dream, like seeing me get into college in the US and go to college in the US. So like there's that factor of it, like it was like external pressures, I guess. But more so like once I've come to college, like that was kind of the motivation for me applying to college. But like now that I'm here, I think like one thing that I appreciate is like college definitely is a time for a lot of like character development. Like you'll go through possibly like the hardest times of your life in college. And really a lot of people that I've spoken to in industry have said that industry is nothing really compared to college. And the amount of like even hours that you're working is nothing compared to college. So I think it really develops this very strong work ethic, especially if you go to places like Berkeley, where like resources are very abundant, but also I guess like you have to like make an effort to kind of like take advantage of those resources. Like they're not just handed on a silver platter to you. So I think like this notion of taking advantage of the different opportunities that you're presented with, and also just like meeting cool people. If I hadn't come to college, obviously I wouldn't have met Alan, wouldn't have been involved with VTOL at Berkeley. I wouldn't have met many of my friends that I have in BC. Wouldn't have worked with all these cool companies. I guess it's just about like network building to a certain degree as well. And then finally, I think it's also about just maturing as a person. And college teaches you a lot about doing things that you kind of take for granted when you're growing up. Things like building good habits when you're not in the presence of people who reinforce those habits, like your parents or your siblings. Things like, I guess, like learning how to cook, which is like a skill that's kind of like taken for granted by many, right? And just doing things like that. I think like that's another important part of college. And I think like increasingly like we've seen founders, especially like who are kind of like circumventing this traditional pathway of education. And like obviously I find myself questioning sometimes like what is the value of all of this, like if I'm just going to be retrained on the job like 6 months in. I think there is value to being in a place, especially like a place like Berkeley, where it's difficult and nothing's handed to you. Like you have to work for every opportunity. You have to stand in long lines sometimes and fight for those opportunities. So I think there is value in that, because that's how the real world works. Like the real world is not all roses and unicorns, right? So,
so tell me, you understand what college means to you.
Yeah.
How are you navigating 2 degrees, a consulting job or consulting club,
yeah,
a VC job,
yeah,
and God knows what else you're a part of?
yeah. As cliche as it sounds, I think it's all about balance. Like everything I do, I have a passion for. Like there's nothing I do that I go into it like doing that work, and then I'm like, oh God, I got to do this, right? Except for maybe some classes that I've taken here at Berkeley. But, like I think I have a passion for everything that I want to do in a day. And I think that's what motivates me to actually like achieve things. Obviously, like it's easy to like when you're like disinterested in something, it's easy to like put something off. And like, I mean, like that's true for like homework and stuff like that. But I think like just this notion of being interested in whatever it is that you choose to get involved in is something that's important. And then I was talking about balance. Like it's cliche, like every person, every like leader, every CEO will talk about this, but it's about like having that drive to outwork everyone at the office, but it's also about like having the ability to like spend time with your loved ones, with your family, with the people you care about the most. So like after a really long day of work, like I'll often just like call my parents at the end of the day, and usually I like try to call them like once every day, like even if it's just for 10 minutes. And I think like psychologically what this does is it like creates like almost like a barrier for your brain where it's like, okay, like now I'm in work mode, I got to like finish these things, and now it's time for me to like take some time to just take a break and reconnect with the people that like are close to me, right? And having that like separation is something that's really important. Otherwise your work will blend with your personal life, and your personal life will blend with your work, which is like very suboptimal. And I think like that's kind of like where this results in burnout and also like unsatisfaction in both your job and your personal life. So I would say like it's important to like get involved with things that you're passionate about, and then like like make time for like reconnecting, and then like also I would say like obviously there is a saturation point, there is a limit to like what you can do as a human being, and there's only a certain number of hours in every day. And I think like what I've seen from college and people who have spoken to me, especially students, is that like they go through this period where like one semester, usually like maybe like sophomore, second year, like fall semester, like they decide to go crazy and do like absolutely everything that they want to do. And they quickly find out that it's impossible. Like there's only 24 hours in a day, right? So I think like that's when they decide to like cut it down a little bit and say like these are like the three things that are most important to me, and these are what I want to pursue, right? So I think it's about like clarity and passion and like I guess reconnection. So
right,
yeah.
I think, and yeah, I was just gonna rephrase that. Like you put it perfectly. So I guess you're an advocate of being focused, understanding what you want, also be driven, but also have like some kind of routine that separates you from everything. Yeah. Very cool. I'm really interested now. If you had to put it simply, like, what drives you? What is the one thing that you'd say sums up your drive, your passion, everything?
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy to be optimistic. Maybe this feeds into my like pessimistic side, but I think like there are a lot of problems in the world that need to be fixed, and that need to be fixed like pretty quickly. And like sustainability, global warming is a core tenet of one of these issues that I think needs to be addressed like immediately. And it's issues that like seem pressing to me, but perhaps like aren't so pressing to others. That's kind of like what instills this almost like fear or concern in me, as to like, like, hey, this is a problem that I've identified, but the people and the customers who might be affected by this, like even they don't know they're affected by this, right? And that's like kind of where like this idea of like entrepreneurship comes in, and having creative ideas to solve these problems. And I think like fundamentally everything comes down to problem solving, whether it be like engineering, whether it be business, whether it be finance. Like every job that you do, you are creating solutions to a problem faced by someone else. And like if you think about it, like every problem to one stakeholder in the very like global context of things is a solution to another stakeholder, right? And like consequently, like that solution might be a problem to another stakeholder, right? So it's develops this like almost like interconnected system. And I think like what drives me is trying to understand like where failures in those systems can occur, like why people might not see global warming as an issue, for example, why people might not recognize that there's a need for a product, like why they continue to use like entrenched systems, for example, or believed in like older ways of thinking. And I think like that's really what drives me, like this notion of always asking like why does something work this way? Can it be improved? I think that just like feeds into the engineer's lens. Like engineers are always looking for ways to optimize something, to improve something, and they're like never really satisfied with their current iteration. Like there's always an iteration after, right? So I think that's kind of like what drives me to a certain degree. Yeah,
I think that's really interesting because I mean you hear all the time like one of the most biggest companies in the world, their CEO is what, an engineer, right? Because they're so good at asking these questions, and they're never, like you said, they're never satisfied because they keep asking why, and they reach a point where there's nobody can give an answer. And now it's like, okay, shoot, let's answer this damn question, you know? It's like, so I think it's really valuable that you have that skill. You, at the very beginning, you mentioned that you were into all these different things from planes, cars, jets, whatever. I forgot what you said, but knowing you personally, I know that you're a really big fan of cars. How did you get into kind of falling in love with automobiles? What is your favorite car brand and why?
Yeah, great question. The last part is very difficult, so I'll have to think about that one. But yeah, I think like the way I got interested in automobiles, one of the first movies that I like watched growing up as a kid was Pixar's Cars. Like that was one of the first movies that I ever watched. And like I remember like going to the theater to watch it with my parents. And it was like it wasn't really a theater, but it was like in a science museum, like in a planetarium where they sometimes like have these like very big screens, and you can like go and watch movies on them. And like I had never been to a movie before, so like I was like what is this? Like, why are we going to a movie? And I was very opposed to the idea of it. And then like obviously we watched the movie, and it's a really good movie. I would recommend it if you haven't watched it. But it's
One,
it's,
2, 3.
One is the OG.
Okay.
After that, I think two is like kind of underrated. Yeah, and then three is also like very good. I think the entire series is good. But yeah, one is definitely the best. But yeah, it's honestly a great story about like just like overcoming struggle, but also like the notion of like what small town life is like, and like how small towns are like adapting to like modern day like needs, and you know like what does it mean to kind of like live in rural America in like the 2000s, right, which was when the movie was released. And then like I don't know, like obviously like my like 4-year-old brain didn't process all of that, but like I just really enjoyed the movie for what it was. And then like obviously like I was like, let's get a CD, and then like I watched it like 8 billion more times. And so I think like that movie was very like instrumental, but like obviously like I have like stayed with that passion for a long time. And like I think it's just like random things in my life that have like helped me like maintain that passion. Like in middle school, like I don't know if you had this at your school, but like I remember they used to do like scholastic book fairs at our school,
right?
And they used to like sometimes like give out like free credits for like magazine subscriptions and stuff like that. So like I subscribed to 3 magazines: National Geographic, which I never read a single issue of, and then I subscribed to Road and Track and Car and Driver, which are like 2 automotive magazines, which I've read every single issue of. And like those magazines and like automotive journalism has also like very much shaped like I guess like my desire to like follow like the trends in the auto industry. And yeah, I think like that's kind of like how I got interested. And then like in terms of like your question about like favorite car brand, I think like also as an F1 fan, like I've been supporting like Ferrari since a very young age, because I don't really know, like I think it's just like one of the oldest teams that has so much heritage, and like there's a quote from Sebastian Vettel. He used to be a driver for Ferrari, but he said like to every degree, like everyone is a Ferrari fan, even the Mercedes drivers. If they tell you that they're not a Ferrari fan, they're just lying. So yeah, I think it's just like a good quote. And I think like this notion of like automobiles and cars, like there's also like some good quotes from like Jeremy Clarkson, so I'm just gonna like plagiarize him a little bit. But he said like most people like they see cars like planes and like ships as like just like a means to get from one place to another, but like other people see them as like living and breathing creatures, like each with their own personality, And I think like that really resonates with me because like each automaker, each like new model that they come out with, like they each have their own personality. At least back in the day when like internal combustion engines existed, but now like everyone's going to EV and like everything's kind of the same. But that's my hot take for later. But yeah, I think like that really resonates with me as like an engineer. Also, like this notion that like whatever you build like is not just a product for someone to just utilize for like one specific function, but it's like a living and breathing entity that involves with you, that like you stay with. And like cars are something that you own for like many years, so like they kind of just become like a part of your family, right? So that has definitely like shaped my interest. And then like to conclude, I'll say like my favorite part of living in the US and moving to America has been this idea of like the Great American Road Trip, which I don't think really exists in literally any other country. And like one of my dreams is to one day do like coast to coast on like one of the interstates, maybe I-10. And like that is one of the goals that I'm working towards, because I think like America is just, I guess like the big cities are obviously like where most of the news and most of the happening like takes place. But these small towns that are like very undiscovered, these like very like remote destinations that are just simply beautiful. Like I think America has like one of the best national park systems in the world. Like these are all things that I feel like everyone who lives in this country and everyone who has the privilege of living in this country should experience. And I think like you should go on a road trip because it just like it just opens your mind to new places and to rural life in the States.
So what's the car you want to take this road trip in? I'm
That's a good
assuming you
question.
have unlimited gas or
It's-
electricity, if that's your thing.
Oh yeah, fair enough. Unlimited gas, I guess, like unlimited money as well, because budget is important. I think like probably some Ferrari derivative. I think like I like the 458 Italia. It's like their last naturally aspirated V8 engine before they started adding like turbochargers and superchargers and like hybrid stuff to like make it like emissions compliant. So yeah, I think like that's like one of the last like pure cars like left. And I think like that would be a dream car to own. So yeah.
Is there any other materialistic goals you're chasing?
Materialistic goals? Not very many. No,
Not
just
very
just
many.
just a big car collection.
Just
just a big car collection.
I mean, you're probably gonna need a garage to put all
Yeah,
those
well,
in.
I have decision paralysis. Like I can't like choose between like I can't even choose like where to go for dinner. So like yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah.
You heard it here, folks. I mean, you got a guy who can do drones, electricity, business, startup, but can't pick a restaurant.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
We have a closing tradition on this podcast where the last guest leaves a question, not knowing who they are. And the question that's been left for you is, what's the one thing that you can go deliberately at without sleeping at all? What's that one thing that you could stay up all night for?
That's a great question. I think this ties back into like a lot of what I've spoken about. I think like one of my passions, like outside of everything that I've already talked about, like venture, professional interests, etc., is I really like to travel. It's a great way to like kind of like reconnect with my background as like a global citizen, and really like it's been hard to like call a certain place home. Because like we're moving so often, right? It's like I call a place home and then like we're gone in the next like 6 months, right? So like it's been very hard to like define what home is. So I think like for me, like I would just consider the world as like my oyster. The world is my home, and like nothing keeps me up at night more than like planning a good road trip or planning a good trip with someone that I'm close to. And I think like, especially when it's somewhere that I haven't gone, somewhere unfamiliar. Like there's this notion of, I guess, like having liminality in the spaces that I explore. And like, I don't know, it's just this very, very interesting feeling of like, you go to a place that like you've never been before, but somehow it feels like familiar. And like that feeling of like, I guess like chasing whatever it is that like you're passionate about, but also like doing that through the lens of travel and I guess like going on a good road trip and chasing a good sunset, for example, right? I think like there's a lot of metaphors like between those two things, like chasing your passions and like chasing a good road as well. So I think like just staying up, planning a good trip is what keeps me up at night. And like I think like ironing out the details, like I'm a person who focuses on the details a lot. So like ironing out what we'll do like every single second of the day is something that like I take pride in. So
interesting. So in the metaphorical and a more literal sense,
Yes.
you're saying that you can stay up all night zooming in further and further into details of whatever it is that you're passionate about.
Exactly. Whatever it is I'm passionate about, whether it be trips, whether it be like venture, whether it be like a startup that like I'm working with, just like going into those details. And most of the time I found like it's not even like staying up at night, but like sometimes in the shower I have like the best ideas in the shower, because like I don't know, like I'll be working for a really long time and then I'll be like I need to like go take a break, and it'll be like a super hard homework problem, and then like literally within 30 seconds of getting into the shower I'll be like, okay, I have the solution. So it's just I guess like that's a nice opportunity to think about these things.
I don't think that often these job postings have like a deep thinker as some kind of like prerequisite. Is this something that you go above and beyond for in terms of the company, or is this something that they ask you to do and you just do you do a good job at it?
That's a good question. I think it's just I don't know. I think it's just maybe a product of like asking those questions and being innately curious and always being like unsatisfied with, I guess, like explanations that are given in classrooms, and like always asking like, how did you get to this step? Like what did you do to get here? Like why is this system like the way it is? I think like that's always been my interest. And I think like it's always like fueled my desire to just be like, I guess like not a very like superficial thinker. Like, I don't know. I just don't like that notion of coming up with a thought that is like underdeveloped, and then like I would never feel comfortable like presenting on a topic that I wouldn't consider myself like somewhat of an expert in. So like I would try to like do research on something like if I'm not unfamiliar with it, right? And then only then I'd kind of like give my opinion on it, right? So I think like this notion of like deep thinking is something that's like a little bit underrated in today's world, because like everybody and their mother can like give an opinion with like a phone camera, right? So like I think it's this idea of like coming up with something that's like different and something that's like based on your lived experiences. And I think a lot of people just don't look at their own experience. Like they try to like draw on the experiences of others. They try to draw on like what others are doing. And that kind of like results in like the shared homologation, or like the shared like regression to homologation, right? So I think like really where you can be unique as an applicant, as a founder, whatever it is you're doing, is by engaging in deep thought and like having like existential crises with yourself almost like, in your business, right? So I think that's the thought behind that.
Nice. Yeah. So continuing on with our tradition, what would you want to ask the next guest?
I think one thing I'd like to ask the next guest is, obviously we talked about professional interests and career tips and things like that. I would like to ask my next guest like what they think their most unique hobby is, like outside of career, outside of everything. Like, what is the one hobby that they have that is like completely off the rails bonkers that like no one else kind of like has? So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Before we go, where can people find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I believe my tag is spininti78. And then you could also find me on Instagram. It's like my name, Shasi Pininti 2.0, I think. And then email also works, spininti78 at berkeley.edu. Yeah, those are 3 ways to reach me.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on today's podcast. It was a pleasure hearing all your views and your tips.
Absolutely.
So really appreciate the time. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Magnus. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I think we talked a lot about a lot of important things today, and I think it was a great experience for me as well. So
before we go, is there any last minute things that you want to say?
No, I think if you're a founder, or just like anyone who's like has some sort of passion for anything, like just go chase whatever it is that you're passionate about. Like it could be a good back road, it could be like a new startup, like whatever it is that you're passionate about, just go out there and just do it. So
awesome. Well, thank you.
Yeah.